We know that children with emotional and behavioral disorders can present unique and serious challenges to schools, as their behavior can interfere with their own learning, as well as affecting the learning of their classmates. Challenging behavior is considered to be any behavior that impedes a child's development, interferes with pro-social behavior, or harms the child and those around them. The behavior is typically excessive and not age-appropriate. Challenging behavior is different in every child. It can vary from hitting and kicking to defiance of rules and authority. What exactly is an emotional or behavior disorder? For students with an emotional or behavioral disorder, defining the condition is actually trickier than what might appear to be at first glance. All students are disruptive occasionally, but some students have patterns of behavior that result in significant problems for themselves, their peers, and their teachers. The criterion really ends up focusing on the pervasiveness of the problem behavior. How often and how many environments does the problem behavior go across? Although problems that stem from children in this disability category may result in serious consequences or serious actions, most students display problems associated with acting out and disruptiveness. They typically aren't endangering the lives or safety of others, but they are difficult to manage in a general education classroom. General education teachers need good classroom management skills and supports, and need access to extra supports when including students that have emotional and behavior disorders. EBD is considered a relatively high incidence disability group. About 8% of children with IEPs receive services for having an emotional behavior disorder diagnosis. As you can see from the slide, about 80% of students are educated in regular public schools. If you add up the regular classroom, resource room, and separate classroom pieces of the pie chart. So that means only about 20% of students that receive services for having an emotional behavior disorder are educated in settings outside of the regular school or public school system. Most communities have some access to an alternative high school that targets kids with behavior disorders as well as kids who have dropped out or left school at some point in time. For instance, if you have an 18-year-old who has dropped out before and really is not interested in going back to a high school and being a freshman when the other kids are about 14 or 15 years old, this student might be much better suited for alternative high schools where the structure is much different. Regional safe schools in Illinois are examples of these types of programs. They serve a number of students for whom the public schools turn out to be not a good match for. There are some teachers and other parents who are not real sympathetic or supportive of students with EBDs. Often, it seems that their idea is that troublemakers should be kicked out of school because they believe they disrupt the education of other kids and corrupt the other kids. Children with emotional behavior disorders can't necessarily help all their behaviors. I'm not saying that we want to excuse problem behavior because of the disability of a student who has an emotional behavior disorder, but we do want to understand that children do have real problems. Also, some children have had difficult life experiences. They themselves have been mistreated and their social learning was disrupted. Social learning is an area of learning that needs to be developed in our schools, just like academic learning, and some children need more help with their social learning than others. Secondly, the kick the troublemakers out crowd needs to understand that if you ban them from school, the only place for them to go is into the community. So it doesn't really solve our problem as a society at all. If kicking them out of school meant that they would go and be productive citizens, then kicking them out would make some sense. But actually, instead of being problems for the educational system, when you kick them out, they just become a problem for the criminal justice system. We're going to spend the most of the time during this first lecture talking about the terminology used to describe students with an EBD. As most of you may have picked up by this time, an emotional behavior disorder is a rather subjective disorder to diagnose. IDEA uses the term seriously emotionally disturbed when defining EBD. Seriously emotionally disturbed or even emotionally disturbed is not usually a term that is used by educators. One reason is that it's kind of hard to figure out how someone's emotions can be disturbed. If I'm angry, does that mean my emotions are disturbed? Or if I'm anxious, does that mean my emotions are disturbed? Not necessarily. The term that is used by educators and most often is emotionally and behavior disorder. And actually, people usually shorten that, like you've heard me already do, to EBD. Let's take a look at the federal definition of SED and try to focus on the italicized text on this slide. I think that's the most important thing. The federal definition says that the term seriously emotionally disturbed means a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics. And on the upcoming slides, we'll see what those characteristics are. This is more extreme behavior, more extreme of a problem. There is an acknowledgement that any behavior you would see in a child with SED, you could also see in any other person. But it's just not as intense, or it won't be as extreme. Again, this gets back to dimensions of frequency of behavior. How often? What's the intensity? How forceful? And the duration, or how long it goes on. And then finally, it has to affect educational performance. A child can have a problem behavior, but if they're making great grades and educationally they're progressing just fine, they wouldn't be eligible underneath IDEA to receive services for an emotional and behavior disorder. This doesn't mean that they don't need help. It simply means that the federal definition of SED requires that their behavior disorder affects the educational performance. The term means a condition exhibiting one or more of the following characteristics. What are the characteristics? The first characteristic the federal government lists is an inability to learn, which cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors. To reframe that means learning problems are not due to an intellectual disability, not due to vision or hearing problems, and they're also not due to health problems. Next, an inability to maintain satisfactory relationships with peers and adults or teachers. This characteristic may be one of the most important. Oftentimes, children have a very difficult time with satisfactory relationships with anyone in their life. This federal definition identifies peers and teachers, but expands much beyond the school, and it also impacts family members. Forming relationships with other family members is often very difficult. The definition also includes inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances. Being angry is not necessarily inappropriate, but under normal circumstances, if someone's angry all the time, then that's an overreaction. And inappropriate behavior or feelings under normal circumstances also include inwardly directed behaviors. For example, a child that feels very, very sad or depressed about something that he or she shouldn't be that sad or depressed about under normal circumstances. So his or her emotions are not necessarily appropriate to the situation. Lastly, the final characteristics of the definition include a general, pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, or a tendency to develop physical symptoms or fears associated with personal or school problems. So if you see a kid get physically sick in regards to certain problems, again, not just once, but often, that would be a characteristic that would fit into the federal definition. In case you thought you were done with the federal definition, there's more. The term includes children who do have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental disorder that makes it difficult for a person to tell the difference between real and unreal experiences. In extreme cases, they are not in touch with reality during a good portion of the time. They don't think logically, and often they don't have normal emotional responses to things. Schizophrenia is a very serious mental health issue. There are, of course, other serious mental health illnesses, but for whatever reason, the federal definition makes sure that children with schizophrenia are included in the law. If students have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, then he or she may be eligible for special education services underneath IDEA. The term does not include children who are socially maladjusted unless it is determined that they are seriously emotionally disturbed. Is it a little confusing? Does anyone have any idea what it means to be socially maladjusted? Let's see. According again to the federal regulations, students who are socially maladjusted include those who receive a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, or ODD. Students with ODD have pretty intense behaviors and are openly uncooperative and often hostile to authority figures, exhibiting difficulty and behavior with any adult authority figure. Also, children with conduct disorders. Students with a conduct disorder may be considered to be delinquent. They are typically bullies. They are mean to others, but they can turn it on or off whenever they see fit. Students with ODD and conduct disorders may not qualify for services for special education, but that does not mean that they wouldn't benefit from the strategies. One other component of the definition includes chronic distress. If a child is not in chronic distress, they're not going to qualify for services for an emotional and behavior disorder. Let's review by considering what a psychologist would check for when suspecting a student may have an emotional or behavior disorder, based upon the federal definition. Here's a checklist. Is it over a long period of time? Is it to a marked degree? Is it adversely affecting educational performance? Are relationships a problem for the student? Does the student show any inappropriate reactions or fears? Under normal circumstances, does a child overreact or become overly distraught so their emotional response is not appropriate to the situation? Is the child in a state of chronic distress? And finally, is schizophrenia suspected? Another way to understand problem behaviors is to classify problems as being either internalizing or externalizing. A child with EBD can have internalizing behaviors that are directed towards themselves, or they can have externalizing behaviors that are directed towards others, or they can have both. Listed here are both internalizing behaviors and externalizing behaviors. Students with externalizing behaviors are most likely to be referred for services, and students who mostly have internalizing behaviors are likely to be overlooked. We must understand that children with emotional behavior disorders are a very heterogeneous group, and one has to be very cautious of suggesting that there would be a certain school program or environment that would work for all students who have an EBD diagnosis. We'll talk about what this might look like in the classroom in our upcoming lectures.